Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our transdisciplinary colloquium in psychedelics and psychedelic studies. So today, my name is Christine Hauskeller, and I'm one of the organizers and founders of this group. It is my great pleasure today to welcome as our guest speaker, Erika Dyck. Professor Erika Dyck is a historian of medicine and drugs and pharmacology and psychiatry. And she has written a lot of books. She's also a feminist, and she has been done a lot of work for actually women integration and the visibility of women in research spaces, including the psychedelic research space. Erika has recently published yet another, I'm jealous to say, yet another book, Expanding Mindscape, and is expecting to bring out the Psychedelic and Vision Odyssey book. So she is really publishing widely and is very invested in many different aspects, the historical, but also the contemporary field of psychedelic studies. Thank you very much, Erika. For you, it's very early, so I've been saying good afternoon. But for Erika, it's actually quite early in the morning in Saskatchewan, which is where she is at the moment. So thank you for getting up early to be ready for this very early breakfast talk. We are glad to have you. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me. I just want to make sure everyone can hear me okay and see the screens okay. Awesome. Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm really excited to be here. It's very snowy here in Saskatchewan, or Treaty 6 territory, in the homeland of the Métis of Saskatchewan. As Christine mentioned, I've been working on the history of psychedelics for, it's embarrassing to admit now, I think it's getting on almost 25 years. So I'm excited to speak to you in this particular moment, as there's this exciting resurgence of interest in psychedelics, and I'm going to blend a little bit of the historical perspective with what we might take in terms of perhaps lessons or insights from the past as we think about some of the challenges on the horizon for whatever the psychedelic future might hold for us. And I wanted to start with these two images to maybe frame up this lecture a little bit. And I think there's some tensions that continue to exist in this space. You know, the kind of scaling up model that we might see in a synthetic model is represented here by these, funky AI produced mushrooms in a beaker, and the countercultural or indigenous, or I'm going to call it, for the sake of framing it, a kind of non-scientific, or at least not Western scientific model of understanding altered states of consciousness and the power or the capacity for plants to induce these kinds of to help us revisit those relationships with the earth. So I'm going to frame it up a little bit that way and then dive in. Sorry here. And I have some funding from the federal government of Canada to support my research chair in the history of health and social justice. But other than that, I don't have any other financial disclosures to tell you about. All right, when I started doing this research in the late 1990s and early 2000s, I sort of zeroed in on a collection of research that took place on the Canadian prairies. And it led me to the coining of the word psychedelic. And so I'm going to start there as a way to sort of maybe think through or even problematize the concept of psychedelics as it was originally conceptualized, and then also maybe get us to think a little bit about whether or not that is still the appropriate term to use. So I was pretty excited when we found this in the archives. When I found this in the archives, this is a letter that is typewritten by Maria Huxley, Aldous Huxley's wife. Aldous Huxley had sort of failing eyesight, so his wife typed a lot of his letters, and he's writing his letters to Humphrey Osmond, and I'll explain their relationship in a moment. And in 1956, you can see in the blue pen below, they're trying to come up with the concept that will capture the sensations they felt when they tried mescaline and later LSD. And Huxley says to Osmond, to make this trivial world sublime, take 0.5 gram of phenerethyme. And beneath that, as he received the letter, you can see Humphrey Osmond writing, "To plumb the depths are so angelic, just take a pinch of psychedelic," in the red ink. And you'll see that little rhyming couplet in a few different variations. Osmond tried a few different variations in his own, and you can find them all over Google if you're interested. What I think is really important about their desire to produce a word in this moment, it stems from an interest in trying to create some space and some vocabulary for creating a kind of open conversation or open discourse around what these substances brought to the psychiatric field. They didn't want their word to necessarily sound psychoanalytic or necessarily psychopharmacological. So infused in this idea of creating its own concept with its own space, they really wanted to bring a variety of things to bear. And I think that's reflected if you read the other 700 pages of correspondence on either side of this letter. That really bears out quite clearly, and hopefully you'll just believe me rather than making me go through all of those pages. But I think it was really interesting that they wanted this word to have a kind of capaciousness, a kind of expansiveness. For Osmond, as a trained psychiatrist, he saw that psychedelics, as he's now coined it, were the kinds of substances that brought uncovered materials to light, bring to light insights. It might be what we would just today describe as traumatic experiences, but it gave people a kind of insight. And to that end, he starts down the path of a kind of psychomimetic use of psychedelics, that is, to mimic madness. But Huxley kind of also pulled him in other directions, thinking about aspects of spirituality and creativity that might kind of produce a more of a tension or a relationship between thinking about psychedelics as they apply in pathological ways, as well as using psychedelics to gain insight in other domains. Like I say, in spirituality, in creativity, and even Huxley might suggest a kind of evolutionary perspective. Of course, he's the grandson of Darwin's best friend, so he couldn't help it. So, I mean, most people working in psychedelics, and even those who don't, are familiar with Aldous Huxley's work, perhaps most famously Brave New World, but Doors of Perception is, of course, one of our starting points in the psychedelic context. And this is a text that he wrote within a month after his first mescaline experience, an experience he had after Humphrey Osmond drove to Los Angeles to bring Aldous Huxley mescaline. And this was their first meeting, and rather a trepidatious one for Humphrey Osmond, who was worried about what might happen to this author who he very much held in high regard. And you see this little snapshot. This is from a postcard that Osmond tucked into his copy of correspondence, which he sent back to Aldous Huxley. And you can see Huxley in his perhaps tweed jacket there, looking out over the valley in Los Angeles. And Osmond says he's surveying Los Angeles through mescalinized eyes. And this friendship, I think, also really helped to continue this correspondence and continue sort of thinking and rethinking the concept of psychedelic. Osmond had also introduced words like hallucinogen. He also pushed the idea of psychomimetic, but they seized upon psychedelic for, I think, this kind of healthy tension or this back and forth that it allowed for, that they felt it allowed for. And of course, if we step back and if I play the role of historian, there are a number of other words that, it wasn't evident that psychedelic was going to be the word that carried the day, even in 1956 when they first uttered it, and certainly not even in 2007 when it was republished in The Lancet. We see different competing ideas that have their own historical baggage or their historical connotations. Sacred plants, entheogens, I think, which was directly introduced to try to move away from the word psychedelic and perhaps avoid some of the baggage that it had accumulated in the 1960s and 70s. Words like fantastica. Sorry, I'm getting very eager cat here, wants to be a part of this. Hallucinogen, psychomimetic, or to mimic madness. These kinds of words and phrases all had their own historical connotations, but it's interesting to see that we still are clinging to the word psychedelic, or we're still using the word psychedelic. So I wanted to use this to kind of step back and think about what the psychedelic renaissance or resurgence represents. What is it that we are trying to bring back to the surface? Is psychedelic still the right word? And in doing this research, the book that Christine mentioned, Expanding Mindscapes as a global history of psychedelics. And in the course of putting together that book, we really wanted to try to tell a story of psychedelics that existed outside of Canada and the United States. We wanted to try to tell a story that did not have Timothy Leary at the center, either as a hero or a villain. And we wanted to sort of move away from some of the usual suspects or usual characters. And in doing so, authors from around the world in a variety of different languages brought forth stories that demonstrated that psychedelics both have historical roots, if we move away from the anachronistic term of psychedelic, if we think about them in the most expansive context, as sacred plants, as non-ordinary states of consciousness, as ceremonial adjuvants, we see a variety of ways that these ideas and these concepts have taken root and have also responded to a lot of some of the sort of American impulses. And I'll seize upon that and go into that in a moment. These are images that hopefully give you a sense of some of the places where we drilled down. Ancient China, contemporary China, also Brazil, different clinical contexts, but also different indigenous and cultural contexts. Walk through that a little bit. We found that not only did psychedelics take root in different clinical contexts, in some ways that looked relatively similar. There are differences between the psychedelic approaches, one that uses a smaller dose of a psychedelic substance and more repeat sessions with more psychoanalytic intentions, and those with what we might say are heroic doses or larger doses, single use sometimes, with a different kind of therapy, psychotherapy. People weren't left alone, but the therapy was less regulated or sort of less regular. But there are also a number of different cultural expressions that we see taking shape around the world. And these are a few examples. Of course, this is dominated in the media by images from places like San Francisco or New York and Greenwich Village. But we also see evidence in the 1960s of these kind of countercultural expressions taking place in places like Sheffield or in Jerusalem or in Sao Paulo. And so I just wanted to, again, kind of paint this up as a bit of a dichotomy. So I'm going to start where I started my own research, which is in sort of trying to understand the psychedelic science, what was going on in the history of psychiatry and within medical experimentation that brought these substances into the light, so to speak, taking them out of that sort of ceremonial context or perhaps even ignoring that ceremonial context. And so, of course, we're going to start with, well, I want to start by kind of looking at, sorry, I'm going to start over again. I thought I was going to start with Bicycle Day, but that's the next slide. In preparation for the Global History of Psychedelics book that we were working on, we wanted to first try to capture where the science was published and what kind of studies were published beginning in the 1920s even, and a little bit earlier, but really we sort of see things picking up steam at that time. And there's a real sort of explosion of interest in psychedelics in the 1950s and early 1960s in the published scientific literature. Now, without going to archives, without going offline, so to speak, these maps help to represent what we found in terms of the digitized material that is readily accessible online. And it shows some really interesting, I think, some interesting movement of substances and ideas and personnel or professionals as they move from one jurisdiction to another and carry with them these ideas about the need to study psychedelics in these medical contexts. But what these maps also readily suggested to us as historians working in this space is that there's a lot of information about psychedelics that has not come online, that is not necessarily in digitized archives or now published in accessible, by that I mean online books, or maybe in languages that haven't moved online and were not accessible to us, though we did have a number of translators working with us as well, or a number of people using different languages. What I want to try to impress upon you with these maps is that we still don't know a lot about psychedelic history, even if I kind of move away from that specific term. And a lot of that, I think, is because some of what we know about the history of psychedelics is that these have taken place in secret, they've taken place offline, they've taken place in ceremonies or in traditions that were never considered part of the mainstream culture enough that they were codified and brought into the kind of dominant language or dominant archival strategies. To that end, I think, there's still a lot of this history that we need to explore. Within the context of the history of pharmacology and the history of science more broadly, and even to some extent the history of empire building, we can see that that psychedelics kind of fit within this longer or larger trajectory of trying to harness the power of plants or understand the particular benefits of plants. Now, if we were to elongate this chart even a little bit more, and these are just a few examples I've pulled for psychedelic purposes, but if we were to take an even wider stance on this, we would see, the increased desire to harness the power of particular alkaloids and plants for industrializing nations. And a good example of this is, as French explorers go into parts of Africa, West Africa, and are looking for rubber. They go past the iboga plant. They recognize that people are using the iboga shrub for something, but it didn't seem to fit with their particular kind of industrializing purposes at the time, and they move past this rather quickly. And so iboga actually comes into this context rather late. But by comparison, we start to see what we might see here is a set of isolation dates that map onto a growing pharmaceutical industry. And you can see psychedelics sort of fitting into that. Albert Hofmann is probably familiar to all of you, and I won't belabor this, but just to say briefly, of course, he is one of the big players in this. And you can see I just got this piece of art. Sorry, I don't know how to use my camera in the mirror image. The piece of art is, of course, an Alex Gray painting that sort of mirrors this idea of Hofmann holding this set of molecules, or this model of molecules, rather. Albert Hofmann was asked by his boss Arthur Stoll in 1938 to investigate the powers of ergot. And to that end, he started to synthesize ergot products, so ergotamine. And you can see an image here of ergot in the top left-hand corner of the four pictures. Sandoz was really interested in ergot because they had encountered stories and even sort of the reputation of ergot being used by midwives. And midwives were using ergot to change blood flow, to affect blood flow such that it would, sorry, I'm stumbling over my words here. I'm not quite awake, I guess. Midwives had been using ergot since the Middle Ages, often to bring about contractions. And this is really helpful if you want to bring about contractions at about 9 months of pregnancy, but it's also really helpful and done rather in secret if you want to bring this about much earlier than 9 months, thus causing a kind of abortion effect. For this reason, the information about ergot was kept rather secret. It was coveted, it was held by skilled midwives, but not necessarily codified. And this is one of those examples where it doesn't really necessarily make it into the official archives, if you will. Nonetheless, this practice was known, and Sandoz thought that maybe there was a pharmaceutical application or potential for using ergot and ergotamine. You can read about this in great detail, in a sort of biochemical detail, in the recently re-released and translated version of ergot alkaloids that Synergetic Press has just released by Albert Hofmann. Sandoz was so interested in this and saw the pharmaceutical potential in it that they actually began to move rye production out of areas that were better suited for the production of rye for food, and moved it into the valley, into the Emmental Valley, for example, and say hired, but compelled, forced psychiatric patients, pictured here with the woman with the gun, to actually manually go and impregnate or inoculate these rye stalks with a solution that would amplify or trigger the production of ergot. Now, ergot, if consumed by humans, can cause all sorts of gangrenous effects. It does change your blood flow, but it actually has quite damaging effects. Ergot consumed by cattle, which much of the rye was destined for, can actually cause a lot of problems with milk production. It creates gangrene in their feet, and actually can cause a lot of problems for beef production as well as for the dairy production. So this is quite interesting to think that in 1938, as the war is on the horizon, they are diverting food supplies when food shortages are on the horizon to put into pharmaceutical production. And this is a rather controversial piece of history that is much better explored by a Swiss historian named Beat Bache. But of course, For those of us interested in psychedelics, this story takes a different turn. And although the ergot didn't really seem to perform all that well in animal models, D-lysergic acid diethylamide, which was one of the ergot derivatives, sat on a shelf for several years. It wasn't until April 16th, 1943, that Albert Hofmann had the first unintentional experience. And a few days later, of course, on Bicycle Day now, April 19th, Albert Hofmann in 1943, Albert Hofmann had the first intentional LSD experience. That day has been memorialized both in his own work, but in a number of graphic novels and in theater productions, and now in a number of different Bicycle Day representations around the world as psychedelics sort of pick up steam again here. And part of why this is, synonymous with Bicycle Day is because he, allegedly hopped on this bike and was plunged into a Salvador Dali painting. He fully experienced this kind of synesthetic effects as the LSD took over his perception and challenged his sense of self and his sense of his own sanity. What isn't highlighted in a lot of these texts, and again, thank you to Christine for prompting this, is the role played by his female lab assistant, his young, I think she was 21 at the time, lab assistant, Susie Ramstein, who's just sort of been lost to history, in part because she got married, changed her name, and we can't find her. But she also accompanied him and actually kept a lot of the notes, which allow us to tell this story now. We believe she was the first woman to take LSD. We also believe she took public transit that day. And you can read about our a little bit of research that Maria Mangini and I have done on this in the Chacruna news in their blog series. Now, Hoffman's introduction of LSD is exciting for us today, but I think in the context of the time, it would have been somewhat benign. There was so much investment in psychopharmacological research at this time that LSD sort of fits into a growing paradigm shift or a psychopharmacological revolution, which is how psychopharmacologist David Healy has described this moment in time. Stan Grof, also himself part of the psychedelic world, has suggested that Hoffman's discovery of LSD generated a powerful wave of interest in brain chemistry, and together with the development of tranquilizers, was directly responsible for what has been called the golden age of psychopharmacology. Now, while I might disagree with Grof here a little bit in suggesting that LSD is not what tipped the scales, I think that it nonetheless is important to recognize that this was a really pinnacle moment within the history of psychiatry and psychopharmacology, as major psychiatric theories and thinking was moving away from custodial or long stay accommodations for psychiatric illnesses and looking towards pharmaceutical solutions to at least ameliorate symptoms. So the investment in psychopharmacology at this time is immense. In fact, psychopharmacologist David Healy, as I mentioned before, has argued that there were more psychopharmacological products discovered and marketed and patented in the 1950s than ever before in human history. And he suggests even that some of those early patents outshine, or the ones that we have today continue to have their roots in that 1950s moment. And there's a corresponding set of changes that are taking place in psychiatry at this time. So with the rise of these pharmaceutical options, we can think about things like Largactil, Thorazine, or chlorpromazine. That's all the same thing, just the different marketing names depending on where you are in the world, or antidepressants like anti-anxiety medications like Miltown. There are a number of products that are now being direct to physician advertised, and this coincides with the American Psychiatric Association's first edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM, which of course over the next few decades becomes the kind of Bible of psychiatric disorders. And many scholars have suggested that there's a kind of nefarious connection here between the rise of psychopharmacology and the introduction of the DSM. And of course, this is not the first classification system, but is one that sort of brings things together and begins to codify some of these disorders in really specific ways, and in ways that become recognized around the world. At the same time that I think these changes are taking place within the profession of psychiatry and within the science of psychopharmacology, there are other reform efforts at place. And again, I'm just trying to paint this larger context. In the province of Saskatchewan, where I incidentally live, Saskatchewan becomes sort of famous in this period for introducing the first allegedly socialist government. or Social Democratic Government, which was the CCF, the flag that you see there in the part of the map that is supposed to represent Saskatchewan. The Cooperative Commonwealth Federation was elected in 1944, and the premier at the time, Tommy Douglas, for those of you who are unfamiliar with Canadian history, I'll just say he's also Kiefer Sutherland's grandfather, if that's helpful to remember. I don't know that it really matters, but it's fun. The Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, led by Tommy Douglas, campaigned openly on a promise to deeply reform the healthcare system. In fact, they wanted to introduce a form of publicly funded healthcare, and indeed that became the kind of blueprint for Canada's Medicare system today. This, of course, did not happen overnight, but one of the things Douglas did, in addition to sitting himself in the seat of the health minister, was to recruit people into positions within medicine and within science and within the civil service more broadly, who had a kind of reform-minded idea. One of the people he recruited was Humphrey Osmond, the psychiatrist who coins the term psychedelic a few years later. Douglas's reasoning here was that he wanted to recruit people who were willing to think outside the box, who were willing to be creative and perhaps even take some kinds of intellectual risks when it came to thinking about the kinds of science and medicine or the sort of clinical pieces that would support a publicly funded healthcare system. And so that becomes really important. Osmond had already started publishing only a few things at this point on hallucinations, and he had suggested in his publications that we needed to pay closer attention to hallucinations, that maybe these shouldn't be written off, and I'm trying to sort of paraphrase what he said, as the tiresome vaporings of sick people. That's me trying to remember his quote. But rather that there may be content within these hallucinations, and this would include delusions or hearing voices, auditory hallucinations, that is, that may be valuable, and we should pay attention to these kinds of experiences. He became very interested in the way that other anthropologists, as well as psychologists in particular, had used substances like mescaline to try to elicit these kinds of hallucinations and try to make sense of them. But he felt that he couldn't get any purchase where he was working in England. And so he took up this position in Saskatchewan. So he's sort of, Osmond arrives sort of buoyed by the optimism that was afforded to him and the kind of research space and the dedicated funding that he received from the Saskatchewan government in order to pursue this kind of research. And right away, he and his two colleagues, John Smithies and Abram Hoffer, publish a couple of articles about schizophrenia. And they're really interested, keep in mind that schizophrenia in its first edition of the DSM is a quite enormous term. It encompasses a number of different psychopathologies that we would see in the DSM today. Nonetheless, some of the features of schizophrenia that he was particularly attracted to as a research model were the psychotic symptoms, the hallucinations, the delusions. He was interested in these perceptual disorders and wondered what taking mescaline himself might allow him to then learn or gain insight about these kinds of psychotic symptoms, which he recognized as being the largest category of disorder that he witnessed in the psychiatric hospital. And this was true around the Western world, again, with schizophrenia in quotation marks here, because it encompasses a lot of things. To that end, he began to explore the psychomimetic properties of mescaline and later LSD. That is, how can substances cause one to have a kind of empathetic appreciation or a window into madness, or to temporarily experience psychosis such that you might then have a greater appreciation for those patients who seem to be suffering under some kind of psychotic moment. He began to encourage psychiatric nurses for the first few years of his time in Weyburn, from 1951 to about 1954. He encouraged psychiatric nurses to take LSD as a window into what their patients were suffering, as a way of appreciating why someone might not want to get out of bed, might have difficulty communicating, or may not want to step on the dark tiles. That's one of the observations that comes up. One of the people who, an interesting character in the story, is Kay Parley, who's pictured here in this graphic novel. Kay Parley was herself diagnosed with bipolar disorder or manic depressive at the time. And then later, this went into remission. She graduated from psychiatric nursing, and she was discouraged by Osmond from taking psychedelics because there was concern that psychedelics could also trigger these kinds of moments. And if somebody already had a family history or direct experience of schizophrenia or any kind of psychotic symptom, they should not take psychedelics for fear that it may trigger something. But Francis Huxley was visiting town. He was staying at the Osmonds' house, and he invited Kay Parley to come over for tea or maybe LSD. I just met with her 2 days ago, and she retold this story, so it's fresh in my mind now. Now, Kay did not necessarily have what we would describe as a positive experience. She felt herself kind of melt into the environment. She started to feel rather depressed. But one of the things that really came to her was that it allowed her to see herself in a different way. She said it allowed her to see her psychosis as part of her, not as something that she was always trying to avoid, but something that was part of who she was, something that she need not fear, something that she could even love about herself. Kay went on to be a coveted sitter in the psychedelic trials that unfolded over the next few years. And I think these sort of dual experiences really helped to shape that experience for her. One of the, sorry, sort of feedback. One of the things that the researchers readily recognized was that it wasn't just the pharmacological effects that were producing the kinds of reactions that people were having. People responded to their environment. They responded to the kind of cues, even triggers within the environment. And rather than try to avoid that by creating a sanitized or sterile environment, researchers began to recognize that they needed to choreograph or calibrate the kind of environmental cues with the pharmacological tempo of the experience itself. And of course, this is different if you use different substances. Again, I'm using a graphic novel here to depict this, but there were magazine articles published in 1953 of a reporter who came to Weyburn, where some of these studies were taking place, and had an artist follow him around, and he sort of described things, the artist sketched them, and this, introduced English readers in Canada to these psychedelic experiences unfolding on the Canadian prairies. But it was not just, this was not superficial. Researchers began to take good, careful note of the kinds of perceptual distortions that were taking place and tried to pay attention to how you might then arrange a room effectively to, in today's language, we might say, to optimize that psychedelic experience or to minimize harms. And so they paid very close attention to the kinds of things in the room, like a crack in a wall could be very disturbing. Maybe we should get some paint for that. But thinking about things like the carpet, often those carpets kind of come to life in these depictions, certainly in the artist's renditions, but also the role of things like mirrors, natural light, access or proximity to bathrooms, the kind of acoustics of a room. So is it echoey? They often brought in carpets often to sort of dampen the echoes that one might experience in the room. And they start to pay a lot of attention to this. These are some images from a 1952 guide. So it's rather rudimentary, but you can see that they're already starting to pay attention to those environmental cues. It's a few years later that they begin, and I say the Saskatchewan-based researchers, but also increasingly researchers throughout North America, begin to question the role of music or the sort of tempo of the experience that might then be calibrated with a kind of musical accompaniment. And I won't go into great detail here, except to just mention that there are sort of two schools of thought by 1953, 1954. Should music be part of the experience to help dampen or downplay the sometimes anxiety that people felt as they came into an experience? So think like kind of elevator music. The idea that you would hear music that would be familiar, but it's not lyrical, you're not singing along, but it just kind of makes you feel calm. Whereas a group of other researchers, most of whom happened to be women who were training as music therapists, began to suggest that rather than using music just to make you feel comfortable, we should use music to bring out different emotions. So time the music or the musical playlist to actually elicit different kinds of emotional responses that they felt might then tie into the different kind of pharmacological responses that one was having. And you can read more about this in these articles if you're interested, and I can happily send some references. Another piece of this, both the acoustic piece, but also thinking about the setting, came from interactions with the Native American Church. Humphrey Osmond, as well as three of his colleagues working in Saskatoon and Regina, attended a Native American church ceremony in 1956. They were invited to participate in this ceremony in part because the Native American Church, which was not yet formally recognized in Canada, was under threat. Both the local police forces were, in the language of the newspapers, harassing these communities for their orgiastic use of peyote to go on drunken sprees. And that's the language that's used in the newspapers. They invited Osmond to come and sort of pled with him to say, can you come and take a look at these ceremonies? And the federal government was all for this. They thought this would be great. We'll get this, guy with a British accent in a tweed jacket to go to this indigenous ceremony, and he will surely tell us the truth. And you can, again, sort of see this reflected in the newspapers about the anticipation of this event. So it's a kind of rare glimpse into the Native American church ceremony, because often, or almost always, these are not, cameras are not allowed, recording devices are not allowed, even to this day. But here, because this was kind of a PR move, this was a very recorded event. I was going to say televised, but it's recorded in the newspapers, and there are about 70 photographs that accompany this. But one of the things that happened was, of course, different from what the federal government anticipated. This didn't result in Humphrey Osmond saying, yes, these are terrible orgiastic drunken sprees, but instead he said, this is absolutely a sacred ceremony that needs to be preserved and protected. Osmond came away from that thinking that actually his clinical team had a lot to learn from participating in this particular ceremony, and then in the others that he subsequently participated in, and they developed a kind of relationship. But we might learn about things like group therapy sessions, or how to think about, organizing the setting in the way that you see here depicted with the teepee. This one is from a moon altar ceremony. And they start to think about, the place of drumming, or the kind of singing, as he described, singing in a tongue that he couldn't understand. In this particular ceremony, they were singing in Cree and Dene, languages that he was unfamiliar with. And he said that kind of rhythm, that kind of metronomic rhythm also was really important in how you could come to experience the peyote in this case. And I just want to acknowledge the images on the right-hand side of the screen here. Many, many years later, so last year, I was invited to participate in a ceremony that were the descendants of the people who came together to meet with Osmond, and they asked that I would write about this and talk about this. And so I want to honor that here, and also acknowledge just that this tradition has continued with, according to the Native American Church today, the President Kelly Daniels, pictured there with me in the bottom, he said that without this particular ceremony, he does not believe that the Native American Church would have been formally or legally recognized in Canada. And so they honor that every year. So there's all this, I think, kind of amazing things going on as the clinical environment is kind of moving away from just looking at the pharmacological reaction and starting to incorporate these other aspects of altered states of consciousness, but also ideas about ceremony that are starting to lend themselves some of the language of even spirituality, or thinking about healing in these other ways that get outside of the frame of Western biomedicine. But at the same time, there are big concerns on the horizon about the place of chemistry in our lives, or if you want to use the DuPont slogan, better living with chemistry. And I think there are a couple of kind of lightning rod moments within the mainstream media that draw public attention to the fears and the dangers associated with consuming chemistry. And thalidomide is one of those. It is not regulated in the United States, but certainly in what was then West Germany and throughout much of Western Europe and in Canada, thalidomide was marketed. And of course, we know now caused teratogenic birth defects, or the deformed limbs of children, and many, many, many sort of miscarriages or spontaneous abortions. Thalidomide really shook public confidence, and I think the images of these children that were splashed across front pages of newspapers really sort of drew public attention to the unknown risks and dangers associated with consuming these kind of chemical substances or these pharmaceuticals. Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, comes out in the same year, 1962. And there are a number of critics now sort of emerging, suggesting that this so-called green revolution, the so-called pharmacological revolution, the chemical revolution, that there are real dangers that we needed to pay attention to. And in fact, maybe we don't know how best to assess the risk profiles of many of these kind of chemicals that are in our paints, in our medicine cabinets, in our fridges, in our oceans. It's here when we see the rise of the blinded controlled trials, the double-blind trials, and then ultimately the randomized controlled trials. These methodologies had been used in the past in a few different places, and they're good examples of methodologies that use this kind of thing, stemming as far back at least as during the Renaissance, and some of the galvanic research that was being done with electricity, for example. But really, it doesn't become the gold standard in clinical trials until the sort of early to mid part of the 1960s. And I think it really does have, it is partly a response to those concerns about things like thalidomide. Psychedelic researchers were critical of the role of clinical trials. They felt that it put too much concentration on that pharmacological effect and negated or ignored all of those environmental, or what we'd later call set and setting context of psychedelic research. And so you can see people like Abe Hoffer and Humphrey Osmond, sorry, I clipped that a little too tight, the double-blind clinical trials, they're somewhat critical of the place of clinical trials in measuring psychedelic effects. Nonetheless, the genie was out of the bottle, the cat was out of the bag. Randomized controlled trials become the gold standard. And according to historian Ned Shorter, that really kind of beds down by about 1966. This becomes the only way you can get research funding, or it increasingly becomes the only way that you can publish papers in this domain. And it starts to squeeze out the scientific studies of psychedelics along those methodological lines. In addition to those kinds of methodological challenges, researchers continuing to use psychedelics, whether those were in Saskatchewan or Spring Grove Hospital or the LA Veterans Hospital or Ronald Sandison at Poway Hospital or Tavistock, a number of researchers were finding that during this period, it was also increasingly difficult to get bona fide volunteers. We might today say, we couldn't get sort of naive drug users to come into these experiences, or into these experiments rather, as subjects. And part of what they describe, they don't use that language of naive drug users, but they talk about people coming into the trials already with their own set of expectations. And partly they were able to determine that because they brought their own records. They brought their own musical playlists, and they said, people are using us for a safe place to take psychedelics rather than a place for us to do bona fide science. And a number of research units shut down at this time or sort of dial back their psychedelic work and shift into other areas. And meanwhile, there are a few researchers who kind of straddle this divide. They try to work with those student researchers, or those students say, well, what do you expect? How do you know this? And you start to see some of those psychedelic researchers sort of veering towards what we might see as the counterculture expression of psychedelics now. And they begin to lose, some of them begin to lose their reputation as credible scientists who are now part of a countercultural revolution, arguably. And I wanted to just acknowledge here as more of maybe of a footnote, but I don't want to lose sight of it, that it's not just sort of people looking at psychedelics who are beginning to form these concerns or these critiques of the way that psychedelics are being measured in this space. But there are a number of people who are also more broadly and more deeply critical of the sort of rising tide of biomedical sciences at this time, who I think also have a really kind of curiosity about psychedelics. We can see that in a number of different movements, and I'll put Michel Foucault here on the screen as one, I think, poignant example of someone who spent his lifetime being critical of the power invested in biomedical sciences and certainly the power invested in psychiatry. But he too was drawn to psychedelics, and this image allegedly is, while he's tripping on LSD in the Death Valley in California. And so I just want to suggest that psychedelics sort of gain this reputation as, attracting this critical edge and moving outside of the mainstream of psychiatry, both because they don't conform with those with the RCTs, but also because they're beginning to attract people who are critical of science, maybe even anti-science or anti-psychiatry. Another example is Eileen Garrett, pictured on the bottom. She's holding a magazine there called Tomorrow, which she co-founded with Humphrey Osmond, which is a parapsychology magazine dedicated to trying to understand other ways of accessing these non-ordinary states of consciousness. And you can see her, it's not the greatest picture, but when you used to have film and cameras and you didn't know what it was going to look like until you developed it, sometimes months later. I think this is a remnant of that. So you get kind of Eileen's back as she's meeting Albert Hoffman in his home in Basel, Switzerland. And this picture was taken by Humphrey Osmond. Perhaps the most sort of the biggest example of this transition out of the clinic into this kind of counterculture moment is the character of Timothy Leary. And some people have even described that there's a kind of Tim Leary effect. We've talked about the Michael Pollan effect in today's moment, sort of hyping up perhaps the psychedelics. And the Tim Leary effect, I think, is something that historians have really seized upon as a turning point within the history of psychedelics, as we move out of something that might have some therapeutic potential and is being published in, leading journals and bona fide scientific journals, into something that looks reckless, that seems counterproductive, that may be feeding a kind of recreational moment that is steering psychedelics into another domain. By the mid and late 1960s, and certainly this explodes in the American context, but I think there are examples from other places in the world where we see psychedelics sort of being imported and infused with a whole host of other movements. And whether or not psychedelics are actually at the heart of that, I think is disputed. But there are certainly examples, and I'll draw your attention to this image on the top left. Many of you may have seen this image. It's a Pulitzer Prize-winning image of this guy in the sort of white turtleneck putting a Gerber daisy in the barrel of this soldier's gun in an anti-Vietnam War protest. I believe this was in San Francisco. Many, many, many years later, I now have it on good authority, but still anonymous authority, that Tall Paul, pictured here, placing the Gerber daisy in the barrel of the gun, was an absolute admirer of LSD and perhaps even contribute to making some himself, maybe to the tune of several million doses. So there are direct examples of LSD or psychedelics being directly connected to the Vietnam protests. And there are also, I think, a kind of rhetoric that's used to fuse this relationship. By this period, though, you start to see, a variety of different cultural platforms drawing in psychedelics as kind of a new hip language, as something to be edgy, something to be cool. It's a different kind of vocabulary and cultural capital. And in response, again, here focusing on the United States to begin with, Richard Nixon becomes the kind of antithetical avatar to Timothy Leary's open psychedelic expression. Nixon, of course, is the one trying to put the lid on everything, including Leary. He declares a war on drugs beginning in 1970, declares Leary to be one of the most, allegedly, he claimed that he was the most dangerous man in America. And a number of public health reports come out at this time, including a dramatic sort of shift to televised media, indicating that LSD is going to cause all sorts of damages, teratogenic birth defects, holes in your brain, that's actually associated with MDMA. It's going to cause insanity. It's going to cause people to jump out of windows, jump off of bridges, et cetera, et cetera. In 1971, the United Nations convenes a convention, you can see on the top left here, on psychotropic substances, in which they have a number of member states, almost all member states, agreeing that psychedelics, and there's a whole list of the substances included, including LSD, of course, are moved to Schedule 1, suggesting that they have no medicinal value, they have no clinical value, and they are of high use or high potential for abuse and addiction. And we can challenge that today, but those are the language that was used at the time. So for some of us, the story sort of stopped there. And I certainly did that in my first book. I said, well, this is kind of where the story stops, right? Psychedelic researcher, if we go back to those maps that I showed you, psychedelic research kind of falls off the map. There are some animal studies that take place. There are some jurisdictions that continue to use LSD and mostly LSD, but to some extent psilocybin in clinical studies at that time. But a lot of it kind of goes dormant in terms of where we find that information. But of course, the story doesn't stop there. And there's a whole proliferation of ideas, attitudes, and cultural products that carry this story forward, but in a different place, and in a place that I'll sound like I'm repeating myself a lot here, but don't make it necessarily into public libraries. Okay, blotter acid may have made it into public libraries, but I mean, the information about it doesn't make it into public libraries or into state archives. There are, however, all sorts of underground ephemera, pamphlets, magazines, zines, and oral histories, of course, that help us to now appreciate that much of what was happening underground is quite robust. And there's a kind of fluorescence or a fluorescing of this underground culture that is keeping psychedelics alive, if you will, both the supplies, but also some of the techniques or ways to, we might say, use harm reduction approaches in taking psychedelics. Now, they don't use that language at the time, but how to stay safe, how to know what doses to take, how to recognize which mushrooms to take, cultivation guides. I don't think I have it here, but there's a DMT guide for how to make your own DMT. And it's difficult to really clearly or confidently date or put these into their sort of historical place. As you can tell, Mary Jane Superweed, I think, is an acronym. I don't think, or a pseudonym rather. I don't think that's someone's real name. So it's difficult for me to say, how many people read this or how widely it circulated, but it's clear from some people who've been collecting these and now slowly starting to donate them, that there's a proliferation of these kinds of underground pamphlets and magazines that are beginning to be distributed. We see, I don't have it here, but there are examples also in Brazil, in Japan, in the Netherlands, probably other places too, but those ones I have seen, and there's a proliferation that's taking place outside of these particular ones, I believe, come from the Bay Area. So two people who sort of loom large in this moment in psychedelic history, in my opinion, are the Shulgins, Alexander or Sasha Shulgin, a chemist, and Anne Shulgin, a psychologist. And these two sort of function a little bit differently in the sense that while they, on the one hand, are underground and, according to their own words, introduced over 200 psychoactive substances into the chemical underground, they also are Sasha in particular is very open with his chemistry. He works with the FDA. The FDA knows exactly where he is. He sometimes outpaces them in terms of introducing new substances, but he's not sort of fully underground in the sense that that people don't know who he is, or he's using a pseudonym, or he's distributing acid from Goa at this time or something like others are. If you haven't already checked it out, Eric Davis has a new book called Blotter, a history of blotter, a title like that. It's a fascinating study of the rise of blotter acid, both the technology behind it, so how people are actually figuring out how heavy the paper has to be to carry it, as well as how thin it has to be to avoid detection, but also the relationship between artists and chemists, or sometimes the collapsing of those two into one person, as people sort of playfully now introduced a form of blotter acid that, again, sort of evaded police detection and surveillance, but continued to keep this part of the history alive in clever and sometimes in rather cheeky ways. These are all shared with permission from Blotter Barn, which is an institute held by Mark McLeod in San Francisco. And again, just to reiterate that this is not something, although I have a bunch of material from San Francisco, it's not something only happening in the Pacific Northwest. We see at this time, sorry, I'm getting some feedback. I don't know if someone's speaking or if it's just me getting feedback. I'm sorry. Over the course of the next few years, few decades rather, more and more of this material becomes visible, which to me suggests that it may have been there before. But certainly we see in Peter Clark's article here about ecstasy, there are a number of handbills and pamphlets that are circulating at rave scenes in 1990s Britain, demonstrating, showing a kind of, how do you take these things safely? How do you watch for, how do you look for doses? How do you check your supplies? So this kind of underground information is circulating very clearly, and a lot of it is quite good information, if you will, that we'd like to keep in the archives for one, but also could be very valuable for psychedelic harm reduction moving forward. And I won't belabor all of these others, but there are a variety of other places around the world where we can start to see that evidence either inscribed in these photographs, but also in the kind of textual documentation that has been left. Oops. Okay, fast forward to the future, or to the now. Apparently the psychedelic renaissance is here. If you read mainstream media, maybe some of you heard about or were even at the massive psychedelic conference in Denver in 2023 in June. I think there were 13,000 people there. Psychedelic science has sort of come back with a real kind of fanfare. There are, more articles published now than ever before, and this is sort of taking over. And I don't know, Christine, are you wanting me to wrap up by standing there? Sorry. No, 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 it's okay. You can stand there. I just didn't know if that was, if you were trying to communicate with me.
Also mute us because you had the sound interference.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Mute me.
It's all good. And I'll kind of move through some of this rather quickly, but of course there are, again, if we come back to that image from the beginning, sort of the mushrooms in the beaker, or the what I hope is, it's a Rick Griffin image from the San Francisco Oracle depicting like this mutual man, and all around him are psychedelic plants. I think there continues to be this tension between, whether psychedelics are coming from a kind of scientific place, or whether the information that we are consuming about psychedelics is coming from a non-scientific place, and the relationship between those two. So in this space right now, I think some of the loudest voices are those that are getting the most likes. If you are checking Facebook or Twitter, I know are coming from these kind of celebrity testimonials, or these new avatars of a kind of psychedelic movement. People like Michael Pollan, maybe Mike Tyson, and I'm sure you all have a long list. There are many we could suggest. And one of the challenges, I think, is that throughout the Prohibition period, it's been really difficult to really develop psychedelic science in the way that may be needed to combat some of the hype that we're seeing that steps outside of that scientific framework, or steps outside of the institutional oversight over how we investigate psychedelics. Despite that, of course, there are researchers engaged in clinical trials. You're probably familiar with the two relatively recent FDA breakthrough status designations, and I suspect there are more on the horizon. And if we look to Canada for a moment, there are a number of jurisdictions, I'm seizing on Canada because I'm more familiar with it, that are starting to reconsider the place of psychedelics within their regulatory framework. I won't belabor the Canadian situation, but suffice to say, there have been a number of incremental moves that have slowly moved psychedelics into a place where we can talk about them. Health Canada is making a 1-by-1 exemption, and now they've moved to allowing psychiatrists to apply for what's called a special access program, or access to use psychedelics. It's still not being used very, very much. There's still clinical trials underway, but the numbers of participants are quite small. It's quite sort of quiet in Canada by comparison with the United States. But that's perhaps always true of pretty much everything. These are just a couple of examples of what's happening in Canada. The other thing I see happening, and maybe slowly, maybe appropriately, I don't know, this is down to opinion now, is institutions are beginning to invest in psychedelic research in meaningful ways. So 10 years ago, with rare exceptions, unless you were Roland Griffiths already with an established career, or David Nutt, who was able to pivot into a very established career, and I don't mean to pick on them just as examples, universities were not hiring new professors to invest in psychedelic research. And that landscape is changing. I think Johns Hopkins' move in 2019 was perhaps sending up a bit of a bat signal there. And a number of institutions have shifted over the last few years, not a tremendous number, but we start to see more and more institutions investing in this as a bona fide area of research, one that is benefited by the kinds of grants and oversight that I think have a public piece or a peer-reviewed piece, which is really different from the way Mike Tyson talks about psychedelics. I don't think he's peer-reviewed. I don't think he had to apply for any kind of funding. And I'm just trying to set up a bit of a dichotomy here. But we still compete with the kinds of cultural capital that come from celebrity testimonials. And again, I'll just pick a few. Mark Messier, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the hockey scene, but he's a big deal in Canadian hockey. Mike Tyson again, Steve Jobs even. This idea that, psychedelics can change your life in this profound and fundamental way that really competes with some of the science that suggests like, maybe we should slow down. Maybe it doesn't change everybody's lives. Maybe we need to think about some of these other effects. So I want to end by suggesting that I think there are a few different things that we can take from sort of seeing this in this broad context and appreciating that historical context, that we know that people can make their own supplies or cultivate their own mushrooms if they desire. And this is something that is going to compete with any kind of regulatory body that's trying to kind of keep the lid on psychedelics. So even if psychedelics are regulated for clinical uses, people who can't access them for a variety of reasons, maybe it costs too much, maybe it's too far away, maybe it's not how they want to take psychedelics, can make their own supplies. And that is going to continue to produce this tension, I think, in a relationship between a sort of white market psychedelics and a underground or black market in psychedelics. I think there's also an opportunity here to think about the relationship between Indigenous ceremony and Indigenous healing traditions that have incorporated psychedelics in the past. I'm talking about NAC, but there are many other examples we could draw from here as we think about opportunities to really reconcile some of what we can learn from those Indigenous traditions and some of perhaps a kind of reciprocal learning opportunity for thinking about how we might improve our clinical outcomes as well as contribute to the safeguarding and protection of Indigenous ceremonies. And then finally, I want to posit that academic institutions bring a kind of bring a different approach to studying psychedelics, one that often requires applying for research funding, getting research ethics, going through a number of steps and protocols, but it also provides a kind of oversight to the information that comes out. That might be very good, but it might also not be flexible enough to compete with the kind of higher paced or hyped up research, not research, but testimonies that are coming in the mainstream media. And we think about those kind of celebrity testimonials. Also, some of the research sort of in between these two poles has relied on philanthropic donations and has had to kind of move between these two streams in order to produce those early trials. And I think we should pause and reflect on the implications of how we fund the so-called psychedelic renaissance and what that means in terms of the kind of oversight and whether it's contributing to a more sustainable psychedelic future or whether we're going to sort of repeat the mistakes of the past. So in final conclusion, I think we need to think broadly and keep being diverse. And thank you for listening. Sorry for going on long. I can stop sharing if you like.
Now, I have a full room of people here, but you can't see them because this room doesn't have, if I understand this right, what does it? No, it doesn't allow me to actually put the camera into the room so that you can actually see. Therefore, could I ask people to ask a question to maybe actually come forward, or are we too cramped here for you to actually climb out? This is sort of a technical question, but not irrelevant. It would be nicer for Erika if she could actually see who's talking and not just have voices from the off. And as far as our online participants are concerned, if you raise your hand, then I can see this and I will call you to ask your question. So please, if you are online and you want to ask a question, just raise your hand. I have Mark wanting to ask a question. Could you please come forward, Mark?
Hey, Erika, nice to see you again.
Hi, Mark.
So I have two questions, one specific, one broad. But if I could just kind of ask whether this is like a fair paraphrase first, and then so you're kind of making this distinction between scientific discourse on the one hand and then non-scientific discourse on the other, but you're also saying that there are plenty of historic examples where those two have merged or learned from each other in terms of practice. So it was really interesting what you spoke about Osman's relationship to the Native American Church, for example, and the fact that by the end of the 1960s, a lot of the scientific research sites were kind of slowly becoming more recreational. So I guess how do you conceive of, this is a broad question, that distinction, the scientific and the non-scientific, because that's the first question. And the second question is, I was really intrigued by the fact that ergot was used by women historically. That's really, I had no idea. How, it reminds me of the Francis Bacon quotation that refers like empiricists when he spoke about in the Renaissance, late Renaissance, when he spoke about the people who actually are using evidence and are efficacious in the healing others are not the high-minded institutions of the apothecaries and the physicians, but actually the peasant cunning folk, the women and men who use basically indigenous or ancestral knowledge and experiment with plants in a way that's much more empirical. How do you find out something like that? How did you find out that fact? And are there more examples? History of pharmacology, not just taking from indigenous people, but taking from peasant traditions as well. Thank you. So those are the two questions.
Thanks, Mark. Big questions to start with. I'll try to take a stab at the first one first. So yeah, I think the sort of frame by which science is codified, and I'm going to use an example here. So the way in which people get published or get grants requires using a particular method or a vocabulary about the science. Now that is both true historically as it is today. And I think, for example, if I write a history paper entirely about, I don't know if I could get away with this, but I doubt that I could get away with writing an entire history paper based on, evidence that I collect from Reddit about how people take psychedelics. Now, maybe I could, I don't know, maybe we're ready for that now, but it seemed even a couple of years ago, perhaps that wouldn't be possible. Or if I did it based on things that I read on Twitter. And yet I think some of these domains, to take a contemporary example, I think some of these domains where people are having conversations about experience actually are very much affecting how people are engaging with the information, how they're making decisions about whether to take psychedelics, under what doses, under what conditions. And if we as academics kind of see that as separate or not scientific or not robust or valid evidence, I think we're missing a huge part of how people are coming to know psychedelics today. And I think that same thing could be applied to the past. So if I ignore the story of blotter acid, or I ignore underground chemists, I do so at my peril in terms of trying to understand how people were actually encountering these substances and making decisions about whether or not to take them and under what conditions. I think, our scientific bodies right now, our funding bodies, are not really ready. Certainly that's my experience as a grant reviewer and grant writer in Canada, and as a reviewer of grants in other places as well. I don't think we're ready to say, okay, this is good evidence. Or we can take anecdotal experience. Trip reports, for example, they're a really good example too. Trip reports are not fitting neatly into the published discourse, and yet they are very much part of the conversation around psychedelics. So how do we reconcile some of these methodological challenges about what counts as evidence? And then all that I'm trying to suggest there is, I think we need to open our minds a bit and perhaps advocate for the kind of, the kind of research, the kind of studies that incorporate these different elements of evidence so that they're not as rigid. That's the one. In terms of finding evidence of people's use or practices of, this is the $1 million question. There are a couple of books that I can recommend specifically around those midwives. And I know there's a dissertation by Naomi Rendina. Again, I can send you that information if you're interested, at Case Western University. And she's written about different ways that women knew plants. Now, you won't find the word psychedelic, and you won't find, the kind, if you're doing a Google search or an index search, you don't find the kinds of words that are necessarily going to lead you right there. It requires a kind of deep and wide reading to appreciate different ways that people are using and harnessing sometimes this knowledge. The same, I think, philosophy, the same approach applies when thinking about Indigenous uses. And I'm very fortunate to have had some amazing conversations with, or being able to listen to amazing conversations by ethnobotanists working in the Pacific Northwest, ethnobotanists who are working with linguists, trying to track and classify and really catalog Indigenous plants. Now, you don't find psychedelics. Nobody says this is a psychedelic plant, but if you listen carefully and wait, and you're patient, you can appreciate, or you begin to appreciate, that there are ways that plants have been incorporated into ceremonies around matters of transition. And sometimes those involve descriptions of what sound like non-ordinary states of consciousness. But going straight to psychedelic, we will miss a lot, or going straight to whatever keywords we want to try to zero in on that particular element, we miss a lot, because the transition, non-ordinary state of consciousness moment, is often sort of embedded in a larger dynamic. So it takes a rethinking, I think, of how we approach the research and the relationship building that is required to get there.
Just a specific follow-up on that. I think I'll email you for the source, but is it clear that Sandoz explicitly knew about the use by women of ergot and wrote that down in their rationale or whatever?
I'm going to ask Christine this question. Well, I'll pass it on. The book that most expresses this most clearly is written in German, and it's through my conversations with him. So I believe he also writes this auf Deutsch. It's called LSD auf dem Land, and this is the book by Beat Bache. And he's an incredible source, incredible researcher in Switzerland, who's been exploring this, and he's been in the Sandoz records back and forth. So yes, I believe yes, and I defer to
Yeah,
I'm going to, once I'm collecting voices here, I'd like to abuse my privilege as chair. But thank you very much for this fantastic talk and really talking us through this complex history. It was wonderful, and explaining also now, in answer to Mark, how to do this historical research, which is really quite difficult because of the way in which our language patterns don't fit historical language patterns. So this is really very interesting to think about, how do you even find out this stuff? Because it would be good if we knew more about it, but it's not easy to do. And that brings me back to, I've heard to give a longer talk about these maps. But there's sort of this question of how knowledge moves between places and from one place to another. And so to ask it as a very straight, blunt question, even though it's a lot of complexity in terms of power structures, etc. in this, but do you think it would be possible to actually do research about, say, the history of the use of psychedelic plants in different, really, on all continents? As I say, big international research projects to actually collect voices and experience narratives of what happens between the 50s and now. One now could actually still try to do such a thing, to have not this very North America centric history, when we know that so much happened elsewhere, but we don't really know well enough.
Mm-hmm. I mean, in principle, yes. I think that would be fantastic. I wonder about how, I guess it's hard to sort of find the universal frame to capture that effectively. If we start with the frame of, like, as we did with Expanding Mindscapes, we're like, psychedelic things happened in other places, and yes, and then I think obviously I'm proud of the book. I think there's good stuff in there, but it also still misses aspects if, again, we're sort of starting with psychedelics and trying to find where it is, or find where psychedelics took root. And it often took a lot of conversation with authors and potential authors about, like, okay, well, we are going to use the word psychedelic because it's a shorthand, but here's the broader intention that we have. And I think that's going to have to be repeated and revived, and maybe we have to. I'm not a fan of dropping psychedelic because I found the word in the archive, so I'm particularly personally attached to it. But beyond that bias, we may have to think about what concept we're really driving at here, and maybe decoupling that from, I don't know, whether we want to, like, move it out of the United States. Maybe there's a term somewhere else, or a concept somewhere else that we want to revive that gives it a different kind of life. I don't know, but I think it's really exciting to bring some of these other places into the conversation. We found that we only have one article that looks at Muslim communities, but I think it's a really important intervention to draw attention to, in this particular article or chapter, the gender dynamics of intoxication in Muslim communities, but also, the consequences of talking about or thinking about psychedelics. It's not a matter of just sort of pointing out where psychedelic activities might have taken place, because there are serious consequences and implications for even talking about that now. The same is true in one of the chapters we have about by Alex Gearin. I should mention that's Manal Khan, who wrote that article. Alex Gearin writes about ayahuasca in Shanghai. And again, this is a really delicate situation, because it's one thing to talk about it and we're excited about it, but also there are real consequences for people who are associated with taking ayahuasca in China. And so we want to be careful not to bring harms into those communities by our efforts to try to draw attention to what we see as a global project. So yeah, it requires a lot of negotiation, I think, and really, I don't think this is something we can do alone. I think it really requires a kind of team, probably interdisciplinary approach. And if I can use this opportunity to just also answer the question in the chat, that I think one of the ways that we tried to sort of get at some of those questions in China was looking at herbalism. And as I understand from my colleagues in China, even that is quite what you're allowed to say about herbalism in China and its relationships, particularly with cannabis, has changed over time. And right now is not a time where we can sort of make that connection clearly, despite the fact that there are texts written in Chinese about this relationship. In the current political climate, that is not something that they want to advertise, and they certainly don't want Chinese scholars are, I'll use the word prohibited. I'm not sure what word I should use there, but what my colleague said is absolutely, we can't talk about that now. Like, yes, we know that happened. We can't talk about it now. So it's interesting to try to come around from a different perspective as well, and still encounter these political challenges.
Thank you. That's a very good answer to keep us thinking. Any questions on this particular subject or other? Yeah, please come forward.
Oh,
Sorry.
it's a
Otherwise, yeah, this voice is coming off, are not very nice for everybody. So like,
Did you see me?
no.
How you doing? Hey, Erika, thank you very much for today. I saw the Tropicalia album and a lot of other stuff in an early slide, and I wondered if you could talk about that, or you had any cool anecdotes, stories, details, etc. from your sort of cultural trove there, in particular that album, or anything else that you want to talk about there.
Sure. I can even, if it's okay, I'll go back to that slide just to make sure everyone is here. There's another piece of Brazilian. Whoops. Let's see, where is it? Was it, did I go past it already?
It was right at the beginning, wasn't it?
Oh, I think it was at the beginning, right?
Global culture slide, where you spoke about stuff that's going on also.
There we go. There's Yeah, so the Tropicalia album, this is a record album from Brazil. I produced in the 1960s, I believe. So this is fascinating, and I really hope that somebody else does more work on this. So there is a book in Portuguese by Julio Del Monto, about LSD in Brazil. And he talks specifically about the kind of cultural setting. And again, it's through my conversations with him, because I don't read Portuguese, but he does have now a translated chapter in our book on expanding mindscapes. And I'm grateful to him and his supervisor, Erika Dyck, who gave us that chapter. As I understand, maybe you know more about this than I do. I want to represent it because I think this is another touch point. But the very bit that I can try to explain that I've come to appreciate is that, first of all, there were clinical trials going on in Brazil that very much followed a lot of what we see in Western Europe or in North America at this time. So, LSD being used to being used to treat, say, alcohol addiction. And in some ways, it looks very similar. But outside of the clinic, what's happening in Brazil is really different. So there's a military dictatorship, which is really important to bear in mind. And yet Brazilian youth are also embracing a kind of independent Brazil that embraces a different kind of cultural moment. So there's the music. Tropicalia is a good example of a kind of Brazilian counterculture. It doesn't sound like Bob Dylan. This is not like, an echo effect from the United States, for example, but it is its own countercultural representation that is somewhat, according to Julio Del Monte, it is somewhat constrained by the military dictatorship that hovers over the scene politically. Tropicalia and there's another, they draw from many of the lyrics and oh, there's another image. It's just behind me if I could get it. But anyway, it's a singer whose name it'll come to me like later in the day. Anyway, the importance here is that what Julio has explained to me is that there was a manifesto produced in the 1920s that coincides with Brazilians' independence that also kind of puts forth this aggressive or strong or bold statement about Brazil needing to create its own culture, its own dynamic culture that is a fusion of its Afro-Brazilian roots that, you know, pushes away from Portugal. And in doing so, they create this statement that roughly translates into, you know, like taking American culture, like they eat American culture and they produce something better. And that spirit or that enthusiasm or that kind of idea is infused in the Tropicalia music, I'm told, which brings in like show tunes and sort of soap opera themes, and again is its own kind of expression that is no less psychedelic than one might see from the Grateful Dead, but produces its own sound, its own Brazilian sound, and it's this kind of strident demonstration of a different form of psychedelia. I don't know if that makes sense, and I'm ventriloquizing what I've learned from Julio. It's really his work.
It's like a canonical album amongst kind of jazz funk, you know, vinyl aficionados who have, you know, Subai and sound systems. And I didn't actually know about, you know, it was so deeply entwined with sort of a contemporary psychedelic culture or modern psychedelic culture in Brazil. So that's fascinating. Thank you.
Such a cool story. I'm so grateful to Julio for drawing my attention to it.
Any more questions? Then, I mean, have you looked into, if I could, because I've become increasingly interested, as you know, in this sort of thing you mentioned about sound and the role of music, and I found it really interesting. It was really new to me that this was actually a discussion certain women had in different lenses of looking at the role that sound would play in trip experiences. But of course, the same would be true for other experiences and environmental contexts as well. So this looking at not only the role of women, which I think we should do more, and I thank you for doing this, but also the question of with your fantastic images from the album covers, from the sort of images you have shown, you have in an interesting way not made many contemporary images other than, I think, these drawings that seem relatively recent, anime kind of images. But so today our psychedelic image repertoire seems in a way either still to hark back to the 1960s culture, or it goes sort of in the retreat or Amazonian, or so do we have any imagery that you have found that is in any way typical, say, or that characterizes something about our today scientificized environment of the Renaissance? When you ask what are we reviving, and is it still the right word? For me, psychedelic was always this, there's also the delic as in delicious, you know. So there's sort of the sensorial and sensuality that sort of comes with a lot of the 60s or retreat imagery seems to be somewhat missing in our current encounters with it. So do you have some thoughts on where we are going when it comes to colors and
Yeah, well, you know, I certainly can't claim any kind of art history. Like anything that I've learned here is from other people helping me. I do think even on this image, on this page here, I'll just draw your attention maybe to, let's see, the kind of blue image down at the bottom. This is from a 1973 text that is written by a German Guatemalan poet or writer, and it's illustrated by his Guatemalan German wife. So Nan Kuz is the illustrator here that I've depicted, but it's a story about a boy taking mescaline, a young man taking mescaline, and sort of his mescaline dreams, and it's called a mescal fairy tale, and it's written as in a way of kind of fusing different ideas about Guatemalan indigenous art and depiction, but also with the cadence and the kind of almost fun or fascinating elements of mescaline in a hippie tradition, in the kind of 1970s hippie tradition. And it's interesting to see that kind of fusion then sort of it carries through these various other areas. You can see in the next image on the like moving up to the right, this is a Japanese magazine from the late 1960s depicting a psychedelic society in Japan. It's a short run, but it has its own kind of aesthetic quality. And all this to say, I think that right now, and if I scooch over to more recent stuff, I think I don't know, I think there's an ambivalence about whether we want the psychedelics of today to acknowledge the 1960s, or whether we want, and this is not, for any of you who've met Rick Doblin, this may not be the most classic image of him, but do we want psychedelics to be dressed in a suit and tie, or do we want it to be in tie-dye? And I think even just those quick flashpoints, even those kind of color schemes and the aesthetic impression, tips our impressions towards, historically reviving something countercultural, or thinking about something that looks much more like, I mean, Aldous Huxley was in a tweed jacket, right? It looks.
This doesn't work. You need to say it now.
Suit and tie-dye, Erika.
Suit and tie-dye. There you go. I mean, I think it leaves an impression. Does it change the ultimate future? I don't know, but I'm very curious to watch this space, because I do see a revival of these kinds of 60s tropes and 60s images, and even the graphic novel. Let's see. Sorry, I'm skipping around my slides here. The graphic novel here that I depicted, this is one that I worked on, and the artist, who didn't know anything about this story before, she was fantastic to work with. She's like, I'm going to use, Sgt. Pepper's album cover as my color palette for this entire book, which, that was her decision, and it was great, and I think it looks really lovely. But it's interesting to see the desire to both link to the past but also reject it at the same time. And so I don't know, I don't see a kind of prominent aesthetic emerging in the 21st century that will be like 50 years from now, 70 years from now, people will be like, that's what the 21st century psychedelic looked like, the same way that we easily kind of get to the tie-dye, or we sort of recognize this psychedelic aesthetic from the 1960s. It seems like there's more of an echo effect here than coming up with something entirely new.
Seems a little like a sort of revival almost of a stage naivete when the field has really gone somewhere else. Yes, please, Nina.
Hello, thank you, Erika. That was lovely. So I have a question about, do you know anything about the Goa psychedelic scene? And also the dichotomy between the counterculture now, and how do you see it play out with the psychedelic renaissance, clinically speaking? Because it's something I've been thinking about, and I come from Goa, so I'm interested.
Oh. Well, I'm certain I can't tell you anything you already don't know. The only I'll just say one thing that Chris Elcock, my co-editor on the Expanding Mindscapes, one thing that we played with as a possibility here, and it brings together these different themes. So the idea that there's a lot of history that we don't know. There's a lot of stuff that went underground. People changed their names. People avoided detection. People, were running away from the police at some cases, so they weren't really leaving a paper trail for historians to follow. We can't say with absolute certainty, but it is clear that when the war on drugs sort of took effect, and throughout the 1970s, a number of underground disappear. Now, maybe they go into the woods in Northern California, but probably not. And some of them go to jail. We know some of them, leave the United States. And in fact, there's probably quite a large number of them. We're talking about a handful of people here, but we know that there are acid dealers, acid suppliers, underground amateur chemists, whatever we want to call them, who head out onto the hippie trail and probably travel through the Middle East. And we know that that kind of pools in Goa. So I can't say like with absolute certainty that Nick Sand left the United States in 1977 and landed in Goa and started the trance scene. But there's probable evidence that some of these amateur chemists made their way through this, now sort of attracted through the hippie trail and going into Goa, along with sound engineers, some of whom were, again, one and the same. There are a number of people who kind of migrate into that space in the late 1970s. And the trance scene, I think, and you may help me on this as well, kind of emerges in the 1980s, producing this other kind of sound, this other kind of psychedelic expression, if you will, that is infused with a whole other set of ideas, part of which is a kind of romance with this kind of Eastern philosophy, this Eastern ideas about the world that are drawing North American and Western European hippies into that space in the first place. But I think there is like a trail, not just like a geographical trail, but a historical trail to be followed here as we try to understand those influences. And I certainly don't want to say like Americans left and then made it cool. That's not my point at all. But I do think there's a fusing together of these different ideas that end up in Goa, which, as I understand, continues to be a space of a kind of alternative living and a kind of psychedelic space. And ironically, on Tuesday, I think it is today Friday, this week, I met with a filmmaker friend of mine who lived in Goa for a long time, and his family comes from northern India, but he lived in Goa himself for a while. And he's like, we need to go to Goa because this is where we have to pick up the story of psychedelics. So watch this space. I'd love to learn more.
Thank you. It's now 5:10, and I think probably you're very exhausted because it's so hard to do such a long Zoom meeting. So I thank you so much for giving us so much of your time doing this on Zoom. Really difficult.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Hope to see you soon in person, and that was fantastic. Thank you so much, Erika. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. On our